Hey there, ladies and gentlemen. You are back once again with the Economancer. Today we're going to be talking about something that I'm kind of passionate about. It isn't economics and it isn't sociology, even though it's associated with them. If you've ever read Narrative Economics by Robert Schiller, or looked into some of the work by Luhmann when he talks about meta-narratives and why we think those are gone, but those are just essentially just changing. But we have this problem in modern society, and I don't know if it's as big of a problem now as it was, but there's this big problem of mental health in the youth that's mind-blowing to me, right? Such as like this giant amount of people that have depression, anxiety, dissociative identity disorder, which is the one that I'm going to be talking about today. Because the problem with dissociative identity disorder and the OSDD, or this other symptomatic treatments of dissociative identity disorder, is that one, it comes down to a nature of people just not knowing what any of this actually is. And then it also goes down to this delusion, this mass hysteria, this mass delusion that's happening associated with social media, which goes back to some of the discussions that I was having with Siegfried in my previous video in role theory. Now, we're going to start off with what is dissociative identity disorder. Now, none of this is scripted, so this is all off the top of my head, so bear with me on this definition. Dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder, is essentially a sub-personality system that can take control in so much as it has actionable capacity from the psyche. Right, that's just mostly nonsensical terms, but basically you have a sub-personality, you have your major personality that's associated with action, and then you have a sub-personality that can do action, that can do things. Some of the symptoms associated with this is what they call amnesia. So you can have temporal amnesia, so you just don't know what happened during this specific amount of time, because that personality, that sub-personality, was in control, and it is compartmentalized away from the other personalities in so much as they're not able to attain knowledge or information during that period. So let's talk about that. First and foremost, they refer to them as systems. They say, well, I'm a person of a system. I'm one of within a system. That is fundamentally incorrect on the neurobiological scale, and it's fundamentally incorrect in using Gestalt psychology, which is what this is kind of based off of. And Gestalt psychology is it's a holistic approach to the psychological matrix or the psyche of a person. And so when you say we are a system, that completely misses the point. The psyche is a system. The personalities in it are subpersonalities. They are broken off of the main system. That doesn't make them systems in themselves, because they don't have autopoietic nature, which is one of the biggest arguments against this. And again, autopoietic means it's recursively restructuring, and that it's self-structuring, right? But these personalities are not that. They have to have the main personality kind of feed the information in, even if there is that amnesia. But we'll continue. So anyway, there's this idea that people have this switch, and these triggers cause these different subpersonalities to overtake their system, and then they are that person for some period of time. And this is extremely apparent when you're looking at the TikTok versions of it, where you see kids at the ages of anywhere from like 13 to 25 talking about having these sub-personality systems, or these personalities that are within their mind that take control. So first and foremost, your personality does not concretize, which means to become concrete, until probably the age of 25, when you become fully cognizant and aware of your perceptions, your actions, consequences, and stuff like that. And this can lead up to the ages of, like, for men, up to 30, because testosterone, differences in neuroplasticity. All of this comes into account. But essentially, 25 is roughly when people become concretized in their personality. And this will lead into things like after that certain age, you're not really into other types of music. Very rarely will you have changes in habit. Very rarely will you have changes in disposition. Most of this will stay pretty much the same with some minor influences that may have some impact here and there. But for the most part, it's pretty much you're stable past that. And you do have some stability from the ages of like 5 to 25, but there's obviously additional plasticity associated with the neural pathways and the neural network because it is far more likely to gain more information. Even though you still have that input and that weighing matrix, that output can be changed a little bit more because the weights are more plastic, they're more bendable. And what I mean by that is if you've never looked at like a neural network or artificial neural network, essentially you have an input, then you have the weights, and then you have the output. Those weights and those hidden layers, those assign different values to that information or that input to lead to the output. Your mind basically does something very similar, which is why when we're talking about communication theory and on all of that, or why the mind is operationally closed but functionally open, because the weights that are used, they're there until they're changed. And so they're operationally closed but functionally open in so much as you can have additional information that continues to change those weights. But if you were just to take someone, pop them in a new place, give them the information, they will weigh that information. They will have an output that is irrespective of the information that's given because they weigh it. Anyway, all of this is just trying to say that if you're telling me that you can concretize this possible, which usually the trigger is something traumatic, this possible traumatic experience that compartmentalizes a piece of the overall psyche and separates it, it does not concretize faster than the rest of the personality or the rest of the psyche in general. It just can't. There's no way for it to. It doesn't have its own structures that it could build. It takes time to build those structures. Some of those structures can be built internally or autopoietically, but not all of them. They still have to follow the same neural path that all of the other parts of the personality system have to have. And this is why most people do not have, and I say most, and I don't know of any legitimate cases of DID where an individual is below the age of 35, because you're also going to have to take into account the amount of time after that traumatic experience or whatever triggered the compartmentalization of that. So let's say you had a traumatic experience at 10, so you would be till 35 before you would have some type of for this neural network to be dominant enough that it could take the light or whatever, to steal something from that one movie that came out bad. So it wouldn't have that effect that you would immediately compartmentalize this, and it would be something associated with a different style of perception or a different view of the world, because it could not do that. That would be a metaphysical reality laid on top of the physical reality of the psyche emerging from the brain. And I'm sure there's plenty of people that are going to have some issues associated with my theory of the mind and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, let's just talk purely about what the science here says, what Gestalt psychology propagates, and how this is influencing young people. Because the way that they're going about these different disparate personality subdomains is entirely incorrect and wrong on the most basic sense of the level of what our personality is and what our psyche is. And it causes me great concern when you look at this and you see what Robert Merton called the self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is something that I've talked about when it comes to mental health in my personal life, where a lot of people, they're told over and over again that they are something. And then they eventually feed into that enough that they become that thing. This is one of the big criticisms I've had with veteran psychology and how it's worked in mass. Let me try to explain this. When suicidality first became an issue associated with veterans, there was a big push for having these conversations with veterans, doing these suicide awareness discussions once a month. What this did, it either entrenched a certain belief or it repressed. Oh, I shouldn't say repress. It pushed away, restrained. It either drove or it restrained, right? So those are the two forces that we have going on here. So the driver is that you're constantly told you're at risk of killing yourself. You're at risk of killing yourself, so on and so forth. The problem with that is that digs into the mind and becomes what is known as a self-fulfilling prophecy, where you feel that you need to fulfill this prophecy. Or if you want to take it from a more abstract philosophical way, what happens in the past is fine. It's leading to the path that you're dependent upon, right? But what the future does is change the present. And so if you have like this future cognition, this precognition of what's going to happen, you're going to eventually change to lead to that conclusion, right? So that wasn't actually set in stone, but because you followed the path of fate, you ended up falling into the exact account, whether that be in a funny, more jovial way where you did everything the opposite of what you thought you were going to do that led you to that position, or where you do everything that you can to lead to that position. Both of those count when it comes to this self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's the first thing to think about when it comes to this narrative exploding. Second is we have this idea that mental health is an epidemic. And this is actually really, really strong in the narrative economics literature, where they actually model these narratives as epidemiological phenomenon. And that makes sense. But there's a difference between modeling something as an epidemiological phenomenon and treating it as an epidemiological phenomenon. Because if you're treating it as one, then you're giving, how should I say this? You're giving credit to the devil that's saying that you have to do this thing. So those are the two important things to think about when we're talking about this. So back to the suicide awareness idea. So that's the driving force, that you should understand that you're associated with this. The restraining force is that they're there going, but don't do it, but don't do it, but don't do it. Right. So now you're at some equilibrium where you're realizing that you're, on this path, and then you're being restrained on this path by some community effort. And that makes sense. Well, one of the problems associated with that is when you pull that community effort out from under that, then that restraining force is reduced. So some soldiers, they were on this path of this self-fulfilling prophecy, but that restraining force of the community was there to deny that reality. And then they're removed from that community because they get out, and then now they're just on this path of self-fulfilling prophecy, and they have to rebuild their neural networks of that sub-personality domain, which is, in this case, it's kind of a bad representation, but think of it that way, that you're kind of represented by this constant neural pathway associated with that. And then you have that restraining factor. That restraining factor is moved. And so now you're just down that path. And that has led to what I think drove some of the veteran suicides, that people aren't willing to take into consideration. And you can apply that same type of logic with what's going on TikTok and stuff like that, with this driving delusion, mass hysteria, this narrative of people having Tourette's, this narrative of people having dissociative identity disorder, anxiety, depression, where a lot of it is people are essentially tricking their minds into something fake so that they can get what may be a dopamine boost, what may be some type of external validation that they're not getting for other reasons. And because we're so dead set on this consuming and validation in our culture, it's just driving people literally insane. But the insanity, and I probably should check these words, but whatever. But the insanity in and of itself isn't the diagnosis that they think they have. The fact that they're diagnosing is the problem. And so I hope this probably comes off as a lot as a ramble, but the meaning here is that there's a mass delusion. It's associated with a narrative. It's based on self-fulfilling prophecies, and it's based on this Gestalt psychology of a driving mechanism and a restraining mechanism. And if there's no constraint to restrain, then that driving mechanism is going to be way more powerful. And you can think of this like if you're pushing a refrigerator, right? The more pressure you apply, the more pressure you get from friction. Or it could be a constant. I don't know. You have to ask a physicist on that one. But that's essentially what it is. It's friction associated with the amount of pressure. If there's no restraining force, then when you push it, guess what? It just goes forever, right? Trying to throw out some physics jokes there. I'm sure somebody will pick up on some of Newton's laws in this discussion. But that's kind of the main point. And the second is understanding what dissociative identity disorder is, why it's not what they think it is, and third, and this is where I'm going to get into this, dissociative identity disorder is not a finality. Because it takes so long for the personality to concretize, especially the disassociated personality substructure, because it would have to build a whole new set of neural pathways associated with that compartmentalized substructure, it is very difficult for you to concretize it. That's why most people actually have this. There's some evidence that shows that this is associated with imaginary friends, but it doesn't concretize. Why? Because it's really easy to intervene on. That's why it's such a rare issue. It's not that it doesn't happen. It's just that a lot of people, they just overwhelm that neural pathway and then they don't have to deal with it anymore because it just becomes integrated back into the total of the psyche. So a lot of these people that think, well, I have this issue, it is concretized now, that's false. It's easy to get past. There's Jungian integration techniques in psychotherapy that are really useful associated with this. There are some behavioralists that can help delve with this. Obviously, there's some good work in clinical psychology in overcoming this, but at the end of the day, it's not a life sentence if you think that you're associated with this, or if you think you do have a compartmentalized substructure of a personality and you're not at the point of concretizing that, because it's a simple fix, because those neural pathways are pretty easy to integrate or pretty easy to rebuild back into the system. Because if you think about it like this, when that compartmentalizes, right, and that trauma separates part of that psyche away from the whole of the psyche, and that thing becomes that substructure, right, there's only a veil over it. It's just a light veil. You can push it down. Over time, because those neural pathways are being built from that substructure, it becomes, it goes from a veil to a fence, from a fence to a wall, from a wall to a castle, right? But you can stop it at any point in time and bulldoze over the fence, and if it's a veil, you can just go knock it down. And that is really important when it comes to these young people and letting them know, like, how do I get past this? One of them is to make sure that there's a restraining force associated with not thinking that you have that, because you don't want to fulfill that prophecy. So restraining force is something communal. In my opinion, this goes back to some of the conversations I had on religion with baptizing lumen. One of the best restraining forces we know of when it comes to people acting out is community. If you're in communion with other people, then you're not going to be willing to act out. You're going to be more empathetic, you're going to be more sympathetic, and you're going to be more willing to understand the nature of the other person without othering them, which is important. And that's the three main things for the takeaway on this. One, people don't really have dissociative identity disorder before the age of like 35 to 40. It doesn't concretize that much. It's preventable fairly easily. If you think that you're associated with it, please seek help before it does concretize, because at that point it is rather difficult to deal with. Third, it's more than likely just a self-fulfilling prophecy where you've already had this like minor compartmentalization and then you feed into it too much and that causes damage, but it's not the damage that you think. It's not dissociative identity disorder. It's actually just a shearing of the psyche itself and causing massive damage to the psyche there. And then last, we have this narrative that we treat with in mental illness growing. We have this narrative, this epidemiological break in reality, but in all actuality, it's just a fundamental problem of consuming and needing validation. And if we just get rid of those ideas when it comes to social media, mental health will be massively increased overall. So I hope that was just a, I hope that wasn't just too much of a rant, probably ridiculous. But like I said, this one off the cuff. I've just been watching a few videos associated with this, and I was like, man, this is down my alley and some of the stuff that I've worked on. So I figured I would have a conversation on it. Thank you. Like, share, subscribe. If you know someone who thinks they have dissociative identity disorder, please send this to them. Hopefully it's helpful. And please go join the Telosbound association and Discord because it's a super fun place to have conversations, and have a good day.